I want to talk about general drafting strategies first. So you've already mentioned one of your key rules and something we talked about on last year's episode as well. Don't draft goalies high. We know that. What are some other general draft strategies you have? Maybe taking wingers and defensemen before centers, maybe taking those dual eligible players. What are some of your key strategies to drafting a complete team, Ken?
So I laid this out last year in I think 4 separate videos. Basically, the top 3 were the most important ones. The first rule was don't draft a goalie in the first 2 rounds. I would say in a 12-team league, once you get past the second round in that 23-24 range, you can start targeting a goalie if that's what your priority is. If you really want that G1 that's like Ilya Sorokin or the number 1 guy. But I wouldn't draft a goalie before that because you're missing out on guys who are so much better than their competition. Like McDavid is like half a point per game better than the number 4 ranked forward, whereas goaltending typically changes year over year. There's I did an analysis. There were top 5 or top 7 lists of the best goalies in fantasy, and there was only 3 names that were on both lists from last year and this year, and that was Hellebuck, Sorokin, and Shesterkin. So if you want one of those guys, you get them at the beginning of the 3rd or end of the 2nd round. But I wouldn't go any earlier than that because you're missing out on a top-tier elite offensive producer. The second rule was to draft 2 elite power play quarterback defensemen within the first 5 or 6 rounds of the draft, because what happened to me last year, I had a couple of different guys that I drafted, and luckily I picked up McAvoy late, who was an injury guy. I had Werenski, and Werenski goes down, and now I'm down a guy who was putting up 3 shots per game. He's a 15 to 20 goal scorer at his best. And if you didn't have that second elite power play quarterback, I would have been, struggling to keep up offensively. So you draft the 1 offensive defenseman, hoping that everything works out. You get the second power play quarterback offensive defenseman to make sure that you're going to have the offensive categories, which typically carry you in fantasy. And then from there, you can fill in, if you want your 3rd defenseman to be another power play quarterback, you can find a little bit more risky option later in the draft. If you want a hits and blocks guy, you can find that even deeper in the draft. But you need those 2 horses that you can count on game in and game out, or week in and week out. And then the third rule was essentially you want to target goal-scoring wingers over point-producing centers. You can find a center who's a point per game or thereabouts. Maybe he's assist heavy, maybe he's not a huge goal scorer, but you can find that as late as you want, basically. You can even find it on the waiver wire. I know it's kind of nuts, but Dylan Larkin was not drafted last year. I picked him up as soon as the draft was over. I threw Pacioretty on IR, picked up Larkin, and he was essentially a point per game center, 3 shots per game. And you can find those guys, maybe not Larkin this year, but you can find those centers late. And what I found this year, looking at the mock draft that we did on Thursday, is right wingers seem to be a premium this year. It usually was right wingers. It fluctuated last year. There was a couple of different, how many guys are putting up a 40-goal pace right winger versus left winger. This year it seems to be the right wingers are a little bit more in terms of, goal scoring. Right wingers, you're going to need to draft them a little bit earlier than you would have potentially thought because it dries up a little bit. And then the guys at the top of the rankings, like Pastrnak, there's questions about how he's going to do. He only had 10 points last year without Bergeron in the lineup, or without him on his line. So this is going to be an interesting conversation for the guys at the top of the draft, and that's going to drop everybody else down. So you're going to want to grab those goal-scoring wingers early. So those were the basic 3 rules. And the only other thing I'll say is that they've changed the positional eligibility this year, at least right now. So there's a lot fewer guys who are dual eligible. So you have to take account of that. And if you were planning on getting a guy like JT Miller, used to be 3 position eligible. I think he's down to 2, but even that's a premium right now when guys are, Draisaitl used to be center left wing. This year he's just a center. So that's a strategy that a lot of people use, is trying to find those guys that are dual or 3 position eligible. That's going to be harder to do this year.
Yeah, another player I noticed who lost his dual eligibility was another one of my horses in my leagues, Timo Meier. He was left wing, right wing on San Jose, being a versatile guy playing up and down the lineup, penalty kill, power play, you name it, he was doing it. But now in New Jersey, he's just playing on one wing. I think it's the right side. So it's important to, I think, have that in the back of your mind. So that's why I sort of wanted to ask you about the dual eligibility players, because I did see some of the updated players, guys who had gained positions. There are far fewer of those, and players who had lost positions. So I know, obviously, when you're between two players, one is just a center, one is a center right wing, say, for example, you're going to go with the dual eligible player. But how much do you actually value that when it comes to drafting, especially in the mid to late rounds?
I mean, one of the things, I don't look at that as much. Like, if I'm going through the draft and I'm trying to plan, I'm going to notice how many centers I have. If I have 2 centers, I'm not going to target another center, just like a pure center. If he's dual eligible, maybe I'll go for him. But once I get past the 6th round, like the top 6 guys that I draft, those are my horses. Those are the guys that you can't miss on. You don't want to take a risk there. And whether or not they're dual position, it matters in the sense that you want positional flexibility so that you can get guys into your lineup week to week. But once you get past that, I'm looking more for either a guy who's elite in 1 or 2 categories, or a guy who's extremely complete, who's going to give me a little bit of everything. And on, if they also have two position, 3 position eligibility, that helps. But I'm kind of more tracking, like, do I have 2 left wingers? Do I have 2 right wingers? If you have, 4 left wingers and no right wingers, the only option that you have is to trade, and you're trading from a position of weakness because everybody knows that you have 4 left wingers. So I'm trying to go through the draft and notice what positions I've got filled. I usually like to go, best player available, maybe a D, maybe a winger or whatever, center, whoever it is. Maybe get that next D, get a goalie, and then by the end of the 6th round, I've got a center, a winger or 2, a defenseman or 2, a goalie, and then I can start building out from there. And I just try to keep track of which positions I'm filling, so that you don't get caught and you're not, if you're trying to look for your first right winger in the 15th round of the draft, you're going to be struggling because there's not going to be a lot left there. But despite that, there is a lot of depth in this year's draft, so you can find some value. You just have to kind of play it right. And as we do more mock drafts, the rankings are going to get more accurate, so you'll be able to make better decisions off that.